On this program, we'll speak with Anne Harrington of the National Nuclear Security Administration and Laura Holgate of the National Security Council about the recent Nuclear Security Summit in Seoul, Korea, and the ways in which the world manages the safety and security of nuclear weapons and materials. Laura, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here with you.
We're trying to let folks know what happened at this big nuclear security summit that was just in Seoul, Korea. Can you tell me how did you assess what happened there?
Well, I thought it was a really great moment of coming together of 58 global leaders looking at the very serious issue of nuclear security. This was a concept invented by President Obama in his speech in Prague in 2009, and the very first summit was held in the United States in 2010. So here 2 years later, we gathered even more leaders together to focus on the seriousness of the risk of nuclear terrorism, the vulnerability of nuclear material around the world, the international cooperation it's going to take to secure that material and prevent it ever coming into the hands of terrorists.
So it's material as well as existing weaponry, huh?
That's right. It covers both sets of concerns.
And then you take one level further and know-how is involved. How do you put things together?
Exactly right.
You know, in the United States, we often are more concerned nowadays with is the correct phrase like a suitcase bomb or something like that? Something that's
improvised
smaller?
Nuclear device. And
tell me the phrase again.
Improvised nuclear device.
So what does that mean in my language?
In your language, it means it's a pretty crude weapon, but it's a weapon that probably has a lot more material in it than our own warheads that we have built to go on the front end of missiles and travel reliably 3,000 miles. A suitcase bomb, or not a suitcase bomb, an improvised nuclear device is almost certainly going to be bigger than a suitcase. The smaller you are, the more sophisticated. Okay. So the less sophisticated are, the larger, because you need more material. And so think more of a truck, minivan, private pleasure craft coming into a harbor. The delivery system is much less sophisticated with an improvised nuclear device, so it can be bigger, it can be clunkier, but it can still create the kind of damage that you saw from the nuclear attacks in Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
When we are looking at terrorism in the United States, there have been a few isolated incidents where somebody on a plane or somebody in Times Square in New York City. Are those things in your domain?
Well, certainly we worry about the nexus between terrorists and weapons of mass destruction. Mm-hmm. And so far, that nexus has remained hypothetical. We have not seen an instance in which terrorists have actually acquired nuclear materials that they could then use to make a weapon. Mm-hmm. We have seen instances of smuggling of highly enriched uranium, fortunately in quantities too small to actually make a weapon with, but in every case the smuggler said, this is just a sample, I could get you more. So we worry very much about what is out there in the black market that may have been stolen or gone missing from facilities decades ago, and keeping that stock of material away from terrorists. Because we also see in the manifestos and in the ideology of terrorists a desire to do harm on the scale of millions of people. Mm-hmm. Nuclear is really one of the very few ways that you can actually have an impact of that character.
So when you're talking about the black market, where do we know material which could be made into a nuclear weapon or some kind of a weapon of mass destruction? Where's that coming from?
Well, we don't know in every case where it's come from. Okay. When we've seized it, it can be difficult to trace it back to its origin. Particularly without the cooperation of the country that it might have come from. We have had a couple instances in which it seems to be Russia, but the Russians don't always share their forensics information that would confirm that. But when you think that there's 1,600 tons of highly enriched uranium and plutonium on the planet, some of it in weapons, much of it in private hands in the nuclear industry, some of it in research facilities, doing good medical isotope work and really good science. Then you start to realize when all you really need is 50 kilograms, how dangerous this can be, and the broad number of facilities or instances in which this material might have come from.
when we jump up a little bit from materials to actual weaponry, how many countries have nuclear weapons?
Well, there's the P5, that meaning U.S., Russia, China, UK, and France, which at the time of the signing of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty in the 1970s already had weapons and were sort of said, okay, you will disarm over time, but in the meantime, you have legal access to weapons. There were 3 countries that never signed the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty that have since developed weapons, most believe, and that's India, Pakistan, and Israel. And then, of course, we've seen North Korea shoot nuclear tests that people believe relate to nuclear weapons. So the nuclear weapons community is thankfully much smaller than we worried about, but it's also growing, however slowly, which is not the direction we want to see.
Iran is kind of an interesting thing, and this occurred to me. It has to do with how much do we know that they might have or not have. And boy, all of a sudden in my preparation for our conversation, Iraq came into the into my mind, because we went to war over weapons of mass destruction which weren't there. And I guess my question is, and you don't have to be an expert on this, is when they talk about war, about nuclear weaponry in a country, I just want to make sure that if that ever comes to pass, somebody better be damn sure there were nuclear weapons there.
Well, at this point,
they weren't the last time around.
Nobody believes that there are actual nuclear weapons in Iran today. And the issue that is concerning is that they are taking steps to enrich material to higher and higher levels. And the higher you get, the closer you come to material that could be used for a weapon. And so that's what people are watching, is the timelines of that enrichment, and then the other activities that would go along in parallel to that, to how you might actually weaponize that material.
And do we have the capability to kind of keep an eye on all of that stuff from way up high, or, as they would say, people on the ground?
Well, I'll give you 2 answers. First of all, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has visits. They have open questions. They've been trying to resolve those questions, but part of that effort includes on-the-ground visits to these facilities and eyes on these facilities. That having been said, we also know that the Iran program originated from a program that was concealed for 20 years. Now, when it comes to what are we doing in an intelligence concept, I'm obviously not going to talk about that on a show like this, but rest assured there's a lot of eyes on that little patch of desert.
And my response would be, well, why not? What is the job of the National Security Council vis-a-vis this whole business of nuclear weapons, nuclear material, terrorism?
Well, the National Security Council's mission is to coordinate the sister agencies and departments around the U.S. government to be sure that the president's guidance is being followed, that his policy direction is being executed, and also to take advantage of the expertise and enthusiasm of our colleagues around the government to present new concepts up to the president. So we see ourselves as kind of moving backwards and forwards, up and down the chain of command. But we're really a place where if there's disputes, or if there's an issue where we all need to pull together to be sure we accomplish the U.S. policy goal, that it's the National Security Council that helps steer that. And we saw that in very good execution in the context of the Nuclear Security Summit. That's an area where we had to have close cooperation among the National Nuclear Security Administration at the Department of Energy, among the State Department, among the Defense Department, and its cooperative activities all over the world. And then the Department of Homeland Security and their domestic nuclear detection office, which is another key piece of the puzzle of nuclear terrorism, is making sure that we can catch the material if it's in motion through detection. So it really was a whole of government enterprise to identify our goals for the summit, to identify what steps we were going to take to improve our own nuclear security in the United States, to work collaboratively with partners all over the world to improve their nuclear security, to remove material from places it doesn't need to be, and then to work with the international organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency, the United Nations, to enhance their ability to do their missions to improve nuclear security globally.
Russia and the United States have the most weapons, right?
That's right.
and we're trying to reduce the number of weapons. Are we making progress in that area?
We've made enormous progress.
Yeah.
And just last
I know
year...
that's a big deal for the president.
It is a big deal for the
us.
president.
Yeah.
And in fact, the same speech that launched the effort to come to a new arms control agreement with Russia was the speech in which he announced his intent to hold a nuclear security summit. And so we really looked to that speech from Prague in April 2009 as our touchstone of his vision of a world without nuclear weapons. And that requires that states who have weapons reduce them, and not just reduce their numbers, but also reduce their salience to our own national security mission.
What does that word mean in there?
Salience.
Yeah.
That we want to be able to protect the American people and American interests without resorting to nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
That requires, and that was reflected in the nuclear posture review that was released earlier this year, or late last year by this administration. And it also includes, not only do you need to reduce the weapons that are there, the role that they play, but you also need to prevent the creation or prevent the opportunities for new weapons to be developed. And so that's how these nuclear security and nuclear arms control pieces fit together.
So we're talking about a couple of things here, and we're coming to the end of our time. Nonproliferation, which is spreading them out, and also reduction at the same time.
That's right.
And really at the base of the whole thing is safety and security, huh? Because of what you know, a lot of which you might not be able to offer here at this, in our conversation. How scared are you of the fact that there might be either some horrible nuclear terrorist activity someplace? I mean, where do you come down on that?
Well, the threat's real. We know that there is material that is not as secure as it should be. We know that there are terrorists who have the goals to kill millions of people, and if those two things ever connect, there's no reason to believe that there will not be a nuclear explosion. We can do a lot of things to try to find it and prevent it and disarm it if we were even able to get close to a device. But ultimately, once the terrorists get material, the problem becomes much harder. So that's why we do everything we can to move the problem back, keep the terrorists over here, keep the material safe and secure, reduce the total amount of material over time, which is related to reducing weapons, because obviously when you eliminate weapons, then you have material, and the material needs to be reduced. So yes, the threat is real, but we're also making progress every day on this issue, and that's what the summit helped identify. We have 20 countries now that have no nuclear material in them, that have been completely cleaned out of nuclear material. So no terrorist need apply in Ukraine or in Hungary for material that they might be able to use in a bomb.
So I detect some optimism there as well.
I am definitely optimistic because I believe that this is a fight that we can win. There's a finite amount of nuclear material on the planet, and what we really need is the political will to execute the job to secure it and eliminate it. We don't need brand new technology. We don't need some big new treaty. We just need the will to act, and that's what the summit's about.
We're at the end of our time. Thank you very much for the education.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
This is America is made possible by the National Education Association, the nation's largest advocate for children and public education. Punsan Corporation, forging a higher global standard. The CTC Foundation, AFO Communications, and the Rotendaro Family Trust.
Anne, thank you so much for joining us. We talk about nuclear energy and nuclear power. Are they the same thing?
I think you could call them the same thing. Nuclear energy, nuclear power, the use of nuclear reactors to generate power, pretty much the same term.
Okay, so and nuclear power, nuclear energy used for electricity, heating, things like that, right?
Correct.
Do we know, or do you know right off the top of your head what percentage of our power in the United States comes from nuclear energy?
I think I should know this more precisely. I think it's about 25%.
Okay. And over the world, throughout the world, it's a big deal, right? More so than in the United States?
In some countries, very much a big deal. France, for example, has 75 to 80% of its power coming from nuclear reactors. So in some countries, very, very substantial. Japan, prior to Fukushima, it was extremely substantial.
How do we step from nuclear power, nuclear energy to nuclear weapons? Is plutonium and uranium, which I don't understand a lot of, are they all used in nuclear power and nuclear weapons? And is it a step up?
You can make a nuclear weapon with either uranium or plutonium, or a combination of the two. You can mine uranium. Uranium exists naturally in many places, including in seawater. And that has been one of the things proposed as a way of ensuring an infinite supply of uranium for a future power demand. Plutonium has to be produced in a reactor. And so that then begins to bring together the whole issue of nuclear energy and the technology for nuclear energy, and then how that might be turned into the direction of supporting a weapons program.
They have a big nuclear security summit in Seoul.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about the who, what, when, where, and why of the summit, because it was very important and maybe didn't get as much coverage here as it might have or should have.
This was the second in a series of nuclear security summits. There will be a third in 2014, hosted by the Netherlands. The first, of course, was the one in 2010 here in Washington. And that summit was really the continuation of part of President Obama's vision. His vision articulated first in April 2009 in Prague of a world free of nuclear weapons. And his challenge to international leaders who were invited to the first summit in 2010 was, how do we get there? What can we do to make the world a safer place and to begin that process of bringing countries, not just the United States and Russia, but other countries too, into this whole discussion of how do we get to nuclear zero. So a logical first step is, let's accept the fact that nuclear is part of our lives. Let's even embrace nuclear energy as part of a mix of energy for the future, a way to ensure energy to many countries around the world in need of supporting economic development, for stability, a way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, all of those things. But we have to be sure that as that nuclear expansion takes place, we are, to the extent possible, putting as much of the genie back in the bottle as we can, as well as making the environment as safe as possible and secure as possible as we expand.
So in Seoul, how many countries participated?
In Seoul, we had, I think the count is something about 50 world leaders, but that included some international organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is an absolutely central player in both the expansion of nuclear energy as well as the security of nuclear materials.
So at the summit was both nuclear energy and nuclear weaponry both taken a look at, i.e. what comes to my mind is Fukushima and what a horror that turned out to be. So we're talking about safety, and we're in producing electricity and the heat. And then also the nuclear weapons, of which I would think that North Korea and Iran would have been at the top of the list. Were both of those taken a look at?
The safety issue has been dealt with through a different mechanism, where we've had a number of summits, international summits, to look at the safety issue. So the Seoul summit focused primarily on the nuclear security element.
Okay.
In particular, it looked at what progress had been made from the 2010 summit and all the commitments that were made by world leaders at that summit and March 2012. And that's where I think you see the power of the summit process really play out. It's very hard for a president or a prime minister to come to a summit, make a commitment, and then do nothing to meet that commitment. So the political thrust and momentum that was created in 2010 played out over the next several years, and then by the time we reached the summit in March, we were up to about 90% of the commitments that had been made 2 years previous being accomplished, which is quite extraordinary.
And what kind of commitments were made and achieving this 90% mark? What had some countries said they would do and they did do?
Well, for example, a number of countries agreed that we need to reduce the amount of highly enriched uranium, which is uranium enriched to anything over 20%, reduce the amount that it's used for civilian purposes. Because once you get above a certain enrichment level of uranium, it becomes much easier to use as a weapon. So you want to keep it down in that lower, less than 20% range. We worked intensively with a number of countries and in very close partnership with Russia and the IAEA on a number of these removals. But right before the summit, we cleaned Mexico out of all of its remaining highly enriched uranium. We worked with Russia to get the rest of the Ukrainian HEU back to Russia. And then a third very important element was Sweden repatriating some plutonium to the United States that it was holding. So those three removals happened shortly before the summit. And I think it was, again, the Mexico removal was actually a partnership between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and the IAEA. The Ukrainian removal involved up to the level of the presidential administration in Russia, the cabinet of ministers in Ukraine. And after we accomplished that, we looked at it and thought, if we hadn't been working with these countries as closely as we have for the past 20 years since the Soviet Union collapsed, the cooperative threat reduction, all these other programs that we've done, we probably never could have accomplished that particular goal.
We just have a couple of minutes left, but I want to know about the work of the National Nuclear Security Administration, which is your baby.
Right. Well, at least a part of it's my baby,
Right.
and we certainly support the whole organization, but we are a quasi-autonomous administration within the Department of Energy. We are responsible for the safe, secure, and reliable nuclear stockpile, and my colleague Don Cook takes care of that. We have my portfolio. We ensure that the nation's Navy has nuclear propulsion systems, both for aircraft carriers and submarines. We do emergency operations. You may not know it, but there's a team in NNSA that before every major event in the United States, whether it's the Super Bowl or the Rose Bowl parade or any major event, has gone out and done a sweep to make sure that there's no nuclear risk to the people who will participate. I would say that our biggest triumph is when people don't know what we're doing and don't notice that we're out there working every day for them. Then we've done our job.
There was a quote in some of the material that I read, "Keep dangerous weapons out of the hands of dangerous people." That's the headline, really, isn't it, huh?
It is, very much.
And it's not only weaponry, but it's also the materials for the weaponry, and then also, I guess, the know-how to put all that stuff together, huh?
the materials, the technology, and the expertise. We track all of those, and to the best of our ability, we keep all of that out of the hands of people who would do us harm.
What would you like folks to take away from our too short conversation in this whole area of nuclear nonproliferation?
The world is not without risk, but I hope that the American people sleep well at night, knowing that there's a small but very dedicated group of people sitting in this NNSA organization whose work it is every day to ensure that nothing bad happens to them.
Thank you so much
Thank you, Dennis.
for the conversation. Thank you very much, and thank you for the work that you do for all of us.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
For information about my new book, The Chance of a Lifetime, and online video for all This Is America programs, visit our website, thisisamerica.net. This is America is made possible by the National Education Association, the nation's largest advocate for children and public education. Punsan Corporation, forging a higher global standard. The CTC Foundation, AFO Communications, and the Rotendaro Family Trust.